let me talk a little bit about kind of what the industry looks like, how it's organized, its culture, it's the political economy that attends it, et cetera. And I'm talking mostly, you mentioned Canadian trucking. There's a lot of really interesting things to say about trucking all around the world, right? The situation in different countries is very different. I'm focusing on the US. So the regulatory environment I'm focused on is the United States. There's some really unique things about trucking here. There's also some things I'll talk about that are actually also the case in Canada or in other environments. But I'm focused on the US. So truckers, I sometimes and other folks have referred to truckers as human infrastructure. Why? Because infrastructure is the kind of thing that is really essential, right, to moving things from place to place, the functioning of the economy. And we tend to take it for granted, right? We only notice infrastructure when it breaks, when the bridge falls down. Similarly, truckers are human beings doing essential work who most of us think about not at all, right? Or we think about them only when we have to go past them on the highway, right? Or we decide we don't want truck parking in our towns or something like that, right? They're kind of folks who do a lot of really essential but invisible labor. It's hard to imagine a more essential group of workers. If you look around this room, if you look at the things on your body, if you look at the things in your bag, there's an extremely high likelihood that everything probably literally everything that you touch was at some point on a truck being driven by a truck driver. This is actually in some ways more true in the digital age than it ever was before, or the import of truckers is higher. Truckers have a little rhyming saying, if you got it, a truck brought it, which kind of alludes to this idea that they're touching everything. And of course, now they're touching everything, and we want the things that they're touching very quickly. And we want a lot of visibility into where that stuff is, right? So you want to check and see where your Amazon delivery is, et cetera. And that goes all up and down the supply chain. There's about 2 million long-haul truckers in the United States. When I use the term long haul, officially that's a legal designation. I'll skip like what it actually means in the law, but basically you can think of these as the folks who are driving very long distances. They're away from their homes for days or weeks at a time. This is not your FedEx driver or your UPS delivery driver. There's really, really interesting issues around how technology is affecting those workers' lives too. But there's also some things that are unique about long haul, and that's the segment that I'm focused on today. Let me tell you a little bit about the political economy of the trucking industry. So in 1980, trucking was formally deregulated in the law. And what this means is that prior to 1980, the federal government played a really central role in setting rates in trucking. So all trucking companies had to charge the same rates for moving things around. And there were also barriers to entry that the federal government imposed for who could run a trucking company. That all went away in 1980. The industry became really, really competitive, started undercutting each other on how much they were charging to consumers. There were a lot of impacts of that legal move, but the most important one for our purposes is what that did to truckers as workers. So truckers in 1980 made about $110,000 per year in today's dollars. After deregulation, truckers made much, much, much less. What truckers make now is about $47,000 a year. And that's been pretty stagnant for about 20 years. So basically, we can point to deregulation as basically having truckers' annual wages. They're doing the same amount of work, if not more work than what they were doing in 1980, but they're getting paid drastically less to do it. There's a really compelling argument made by trucking economists, transport economists, that trucking is essentially sweatshop labor on wheels. If you look at the amount of money that they make for the work that they do, the number of hours that they drive, and the amount of physical risk that they encounter while they're doing that work, it's basically equivalent to what we often would consider sweatshop labor in factories. I could go on about this forever and I'll contain myself, but if you look at basically any measure of job quality, health outcomes, mental health outcomes, occupational fatalities, truckers have the 8th highest rate of occupational fatalities in the country. They have higher rates of basically every physical malady you can think of: diabetes, high blood pressure, sleep apnea, PTSD. It's a really, really hard job on your body. It's a hard job on your mind. Being away from home and having an irregular schedule, you get shift work syndrome, right? You're not necessarily always awake at the same time each day. It's hard to ever schedule an appointment to go see the doctor because you don't necessarily know when you're going to be home. Obviously, there are kind of social or personal costs of being away from your family all the time. It's just a very, very difficult job to do. I'll note this just quickly. Truckers are legally exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act. There's like a line item exemption in the Fair Labor Standards Act. That's the law that grants most workers overtime and other workplace protections. Truckers specifically don't get that, and I'll talk a little bit in a minute about kind of how truckers are paid and why this matters for them. In part because this job is so hard, there is what trucking companies will often call a trucker shortage, right? So trucking companies are almost always looking to hire new truck drivers. Truckers will be very quick to correct that, and they'll say it's not a trucker shortage, it's a wage shortage, right? There's plenty of us. The issue is that you're not willing to pay us for the work that we're doing. But the turnover rate in trucking approaches actually 100% a year. If you think about it, another industry that has a high turnover rate that is that high is people who work at Panera. So like basically everyone who works at Panera leaves their job every year. Basically everyone who's a truck driver ends up leaving their job or leaving the industry every year. And sometimes that looks like people hop firm to firm. Sometimes what it looks like is that people are just sort of chewed up and spit out by the industry, right? It's really a difficult industry to stay in. Maybe despite that, or a compliment to those really difficult labor conditions, is that trucking culture is very proud. I've talked to a lot of truckers at this point. And you meet a lot of truckers. If you ask a trucker, like, why did you get into doing this work? A lot of them will tell you it's because I didn't want someone looking over my shoulder all the time. I wanted to have control over the decisions I made every day at work, right? A lot of these folks come from places in the country where there aren't necessarily a lot of other economic opportunities for people without college education, which a lot of truckers don't have. It enables a form of autonomy that is really, really hard to come by in blue collar work and has historically done that for a lot of people. There's a strong kind of sense of, sometimes it gets characterized as cowboyism or resistance, a sense of sort of pride and autonomy in the work that truckers are doing. This manifests in lots of different ways. It's also strongly associated with manhood. So trucking now is, I think, 94% male by the numbers. But just culturally, right, there's like a lot of images of truckers that are strongly associated with masculinity, with stamina, with the idea to kind of like, that you can stay behind the wheel for long periods of time. And a lot of truckers will associate that with masculinity. There's kind of one dark side of this kind of emphasis on stamina has to do with the way that truckers are paid. Truckers are extremely fatigued. They are notoriously overworked and underpaid. They routinely work more than 70, 80 hours a week. And they are not paid for all of that time. So there's another little rhyming saying in trucking, if the wheel ain't turning, you ain't earning. Now, what this refers to is that most truckers, like the lion's share of truckers in the United States, are paid on a piece rate basis. So they're paid by the mile that they drive. That means they're not paid at all when they're not moving. So they're not paid at all when they are sitting in traffic. They're not paid at all when they're in a snowstorm. They're not paid at all when they're just in the city, right? When they're moving really slow, or they're paid very little when they're in a city moving very slowly. They're not paid when they're waiting to be loaded or unloaded at a terminal. They're not paid when they're doing inspections they're required to do. They're not paid when they're resting or taking required breaks. They're only paid by and large when they're moving. And so then, of course, what happens is that they are incentivized to move as much as they possibly can, right? To stay on the road, sometimes long past their body's capabilities, right? And this is, built into kind of the wage structure of the industry. This is what we've come to expect from truckers to get their work done. In many cases, truckers are coerced by their employers to stay on the road to make on-time deliveries, even in contexts where it might not be safe for them to do that. There's a lot that I could say that I say in the book, but won't say today about the lengths that truckers will go to stay awake, right, in the face of these demands. They will, in some cases do things like, drink a lot of Red Bull, take caffeine pills. Sometimes illegal stimulants have entered the picture. There's lots and lots of, very colorful stories about the lengths that truckers will go to stay awake because they have to. Probably, I think the one time that this has entered the public consciousness, at least since I've been paying attention, was in 2014 when the comedian Tracy Morgan was in an accident. I don't know if folks remember when this happened. You guys know Tracy Morgan? Okay, I wasn't sure if it's like, I'm now old. Tracy Morgan is, but I think I still think he's funny. He was in, as you may remember, this really, really severe accident between his tour bus and a Walmart truck driver in 2014. The accident report established at the time that the Walmart driver had been awake for 28 hours prior to the accident. That's like a pretty exceptional situation in some ways, right? 28 hours straight of being awake. And I forget how many of those hours he'd been working, but a lot of them is in some ways exceptional, but it's not that exceptional when you look at kind of the things that truckers are sometimes required to do. Now, the federal government, right, caps the number of hours truckers can drive. They've done this since the 1930s. for reasons that you would expect, right? For safety reasons, because of the recognition that being on the road constantly is like not a safe thing for the motoring public or for truckers. I will spare you the ins and outs of what are called the hours of service regulations, which are regulations that are promulgated by the Department of Transportation. The basic, like they're complicated, but most of what you need to know is that truckers can drive 70 hours, or excuse me, they can work 70 hours a week. They can work 14 hours a day, of which 11 can be driving. It's more complicated than that, but like those are the broad strokes. What's more important than those numbers is how truckers have historically kept track of the hours that they work. And the way they've done this for like close to 70 years, from the 30s until very recently, was via paper and pencil logbooks. And I'm showing you on a slide here what these logbooks look like. You could buy a book of these at any truck stop for a couple of dollars. And if we had more time, we could like walk through how you fill out this logbook. It is not hard to do. This center, what's called the grid graph in the middle, is showing time, right? This is from midnight to midnight. And basically all you do is you have a pencil and a ruler, and you indicate on the grid graph at what time you were driving, at what time you were sleeping, at what time you were doing other work-related things, and then where you were geographically when you changed duty statuses. And then you add this up and you show the number on the right, and this has to be less than the federal cap. You have to keep the last 7 days of your log current and be prepared to show them to law enforcement if you get pulled over or if you go through a weigh station. These aren't pay documents. These documents aren't connected to how much truckers are paid. They're just regulatory compliance documents, right? So they have to keep them up to date. The problem with this is that it is very, very easy to fudge your log. And truckers are, it's like a really open secret in the trucking community that like oftentimes you need to fudge your log and make it look as though you completed a trip within the legal amount of time when you actually weren't able to do that, right? And there's lots of reasons that might be. Anyone who's ever taken a road trip knows that you can't always predict exactly how much time it'll take to get from A to B, right? If you run out of hours and you're 20 minutes from your pickup point, you're not going to stop, right? Like that would be unrealistic. Your employer's not going to let you do it. It's very likely there's not a safe place for you to park anyway. So truckers do what they have to do, and then they would make the log, in many cases, reflect what was legal for them to do. Now, this all changed a few years ago. The Department of Transportation didn't love that truckers were like not being really honest with their logbooks. And they chose to address this not by changing the underlying incentives for truckers to drive the long hours that they were doing, but by instead changing that logbook to a digital version. What I'm showing you here is something called the electronic logging device, or ELD. This is the centerpiece. This is like the technological centerpiece of the book that I wrote, is the ELD. And a lot of what I'm focused on is the transition from manual record keeping under paper logbooks to this digital device. This one that I'm showing you is actually old. You can see the date says 2009. But I'm showing you this one because it has that same grid graph in the middle, right? So you can kind of tell easily that this is just a digital version of the piece of paper that I was showing you before. Now, the way that this works is that this is hardwired into the truck's engine. So it's basically automatically keeping a record of when the truck is moving and when the driver is driving and when they're not. And it's keeping all those time records automatically. The idea is that this is meant to be a more tamper-proof version of the paper and pencil. Now, it's not perfectly tamper-proof. And one chapter of my book is focused on like all the ways that they're not really tamper-proof and that actually you can still lie using an ELD. But definitely it's more difficult, right? It's more complicated to actually fudge the numbers with an ELD than it is on paper. Now, this device has been mandatory in the industry for all truckers since 2017. I started studying the ELD and the trucking industry's relationship to technology in 2011. So a lot of companies were like beginning to use ELDs around that time, or were experimenting with ELDs. So I studied companies that were making that transition, companies that were using paper logs, and companies that were using electronic logs during that period of transition. If people are interested, I can give you more detail on kind of the methods that I used and all the different people I talked to. But I was very interested in kind of what does this moment of transition tell us about what it is to be a trucker, truckers' relationships with their managers, truckers' relationships with the government, and then more generally, kind of how we can understand the role that digital technologies like this play in the workplace today, not just for truckers, but for workers more generally. You can sort of imagine, based on what you know about truckers, like how popular these devices were. These are just a few, I won't read these, but these are just a few quotes from some of the work that I did. Truckers almost universally, in my discussions with them, said that these devices treated them like children, treated them like criminals, were seen as kind of an affront to their autonomy and decision-making capability to do the work that they needed to do in the time that they had to do it. There were, of course, some truckers that had no problem with this, right, or said, this evens the playing field for me, or like, I don't want to be breaking the law, and this will be a good thing because this means no one else can break the law. But by and large, the sentiment was pretty negative about the electronic logging device and what it would mean for the workers. One of the reasons that truckers responded negatively to ELDs actually has to do not with what the government was tracking about them, but what the ELD allowed their managers or their firms to know about what they were doing. So what I'm showing you here, this is like a comparison chart from a brochure for a company that makes ELDs, right? These are different types of ELD models. And you can see I put an arrow next to this row that says hours of service. So that's everything I just finished talking to you about, right? That's this regulatory tracking capability. But you can see that this ELD, right, all models of ELD not only keep track of hours of service, they also do lots and lots of other stuff, right? So it's almost as though the government said, everybody needs to buy a telephone that makes calls, right? But like we all know, it's really hard to buy a telephone that just makes calls. If you buy a phone that makes calls, it'll probably also be bundled with, you know, the ability to get online, the ability to use maps and messaging and all that other stuff that comes in our phone, right? And the ELD is kind of not that different. The ELD very often contains a lot of monitoring features that allow trucking companies to have much more visibility into what their workers are doing. So among the types of things that ELDs often enable are things like knowing how fast a trucker is going, knowing what his fuel efficiency is, knowing if he's changing lanes without signaling, knowing if they've left a pre-specified route, knowing if they're braking hard, right? Lots and lots of performance monitoring stuff. And then those data are used in lots of different ways. One of the ways in which they're used is to just give managers or dispatchers visibility into what truckers are doing in ways that they have not previously been able to do. If we had more time, I would like force someone to play act this transcript with me, but we don't, unfortunately for you guys, we don't have time. But like one of the things I go into in a bunch of depth in the book is kind of how this moves the center of expertise from the trucker's mind to this kind of external source of like abstracted, inferred data about what the conditions in the trucker's body must be, or what the conditions around the truck must be according to the dispatcher who isn't there, right? Based on data that they're inferring from this device. So a lot of it is focused on that. And then, oh, sorry, I skipped a slide. Or then also focused on how these data are used to score drivers, compare drivers, incentivize drivers in different ways, some of which aren't that unfamiliar because we actually see this happening across all kinds of different jobs now, right? So in some sense, truckers are dealing with a lot of the same dynamics that a lot of workers are dealing with respect to datafication of the workplace. Now, one thing I did, so I mentioned this is an ethnographic project. I spent about 3 years talking to truckers, talking to regulators, talking to insurance agents, talking to safety offices, talking to managers, talking to anyone who would talk to me about the trucking industry. I went to 11 different states altogether. I sat in 4 different firms and watched how they talked to their drivers. I just like was a sponge for a long time talking to people about this stuff. I went to truck shows, truck stops, law offices, just everywhere. It was super, super fun. I had a great time. One thing I did that was less fun, but I'm so glad I did it, was that I looked through about 5,000 comments that were submitted to the federal government through notice and comment processes on pending regulations about, there were 5 different rulemakings related to the electronic logging device. And I analyzed those in a paper that I didn't include in the book because it's more quantitative and it's a little bit boring to read. But it was really interesting, right, to like see what comments truckers and firms and other stakeholders submitted to the government in making arguments about whether or not this technology should be required. I am just going to pull out one of those comments out of those many thousands of comments because it strikes me now as like very eerily prescient. So this is a trucker who was writing, I want to say in 2012, writing into the government against the ELD mandate. And he says, a computer doesn't know when we are tired, fatigued, or anything else. Any piece of electronics that is not directly hooked up to my body cannot tell me this. Now, I am pretty sure that like this truck, I don't know this trucker, but I'm pretty sure that he was not like the thing he was trying to say was not, you know what you guys should do? Directly hook this thing up to my body. Like that was not the alternative future he was imagining for the industry. And yet, as we shall see, what kind of comes to occur a few years later in the context of trucking is something sort of like what this trucker had envisioned. So that's what I thought I would do with the rest of our time together, which ends at what point? Like, when should I stop talking? Whenever. Okay, if it starts at, give me one of these if I start to go too long. Okay, so we're fine. Okay, deal. So anyway, that's like, those are the broad strokes of the book. That's most of what it's about. I talk in the book, as I mentioned, about management. I talk about relationships with law enforcement officers. One other thing I did was I sat in for a few days with commercial vehicle inspectors, law enforcement agents, while they did inspections of trucks. And I got to, which was also really fun, I got to hang out with them and get up into trucks and watch them. I mean, they don't kick, well, sometimes they do literally kick the tires. I did not kick the tires. But I got to see what those inspections look like and how those inspections are different when the digital technology is at play versus the manual record keeping. There's a chapter, as I mentioned, about resistance practices. What are the things that truckers do to push back? And then the last substantive chapter of the book, I get into autonomy. So I noticed, it took me a while to write this book. I had 2 children. I moved. I did lots of other things. Around 2016, 2017, I was like still working on this book. I had been studying truckers for about 5 years. And I would tell people, like, I'm studying truckers and technology. I'm writing a book about truckers and technology. And they would say, like, oh yeah, autonomous vehicles, right? Autonomous trucks. And I would say, no, not that. This other thing, this little box you've never heard of that goes in the truck and makes truckers' lives pretty miserable. And they would say, like, but who cares? Because soon there will be no more truck drivers, right? And I will admit to you, candidly, that I felt like, oh shit, like I took too long to write this book. Like, soon there'll be no truckers, which is terrible and means like no one will care about my book anymore, selfishly. So I thought, like, okay, what I really need to do is try to understand, like, it was obvious why people were saying this, right? There was lots and lots of rhetoric going around at that time, around 2015, 2016, about this kind of wave of automation and how it was going to take away everyone's job. We see a lot of this happening actually again now, right? Like maybe you've noticed the last few months, I think there's been another resurgence in this kind of rhetoric about automation and low-wage work. But what I decided to do was not just brush it under the rug, but to actually engage with this. So the last chapter of the book is kind of looking at the relationship between AI and autonomy and trucking work. So I thought with the time that we have left, I'll dig a little bit more into that last chapter of the book. So, I mentioned, there was like there were a bunch of media reports at this time about automation and work and what jobs were likely to be lost. I will go quickly through this because if people are interested, I can go into more depth, but there is like a very, very long history of economists and others trying to make predictions about which jobs are going to be lost in the next wave of technical advances, whether that means automation or AI or other technical developments. This is a paper by 3 economists. Frank Levy is no relation to me, although I met him once and he was very nice, but we're not related as far as we can tell. This is a really well-known paper, like very influential paper from 2003. That was kind of trying to make this prediction based on the state of digital technology in 2003 about which jobs were likely to be automated. At that time in 2003, actually, Autor and his colleagues thought that truck driving was one of the jobs that was likely to be safe from automation. The reason was at that time, the things that economists and others looked at was whether jobs were manual or kind of cognitive, which is obviously a very coarse distinction. And at that time, they were also adding to this whether jobs consisted largely of routine tasks that you could sort of write down. These are the things you need to do repeatedly versus non-routine tasks, right? As the worker seeing things or encountering situations that they've never seen before. And they said, based on kind of the state of computation now, this is 20 years ago, and the fact that trucking consists of a lot of, it's manual and cognitive, but includes a lot of manual tasks and a lot of non-routine situations, right? Like you've never seen this traffic situation before, you've never been on this road before. They thought trucking is safe. Fast forward 10 years, in 2013, we get kind of another wave of conversation about what then the beginning of the burgeoning of the current AI age. Big advances in computer vision, big advances in machine learning. There's another really influential paper that comes out at that time by Fry and Osborne, an economist and a machine learning researcher, kind of again saying, all right, given the current state of AI and automation technologies, which jobs do we think are likely to be automated away? They had a very dire prediction. They actually thought 47% of American jobs were likely to be automated away within, I think, a decade. That obviously didn't happen. It was like, okay, guys. But it was a very influential paper. I didn't pick this just to pick on it, right? Like the White House cited this figure. They thought actually that trucking was kind of right in the crosshairs of one of the jobs that was like ripe to be automated, in part because some of the problems in the industry that I mentioned, right? The labor shortage, et cetera. And in part because there had been these really massive advances in some of the technologies that we might think would lend themselves to automating away human truckers. So they said, this is a graphic from an NPR story that was about this paper. They said, this is very precise, but they said truck drivers had a 78.6% chance of being automated away in some number of years. That didn't happen either, right? But like this was the prediction. And of course, like this prediction generates a lot of concern, right? From policymakers, from the public. Part of which is driven by the idea that, you know, if you have nearly 2 million workers, some of whom are coming from parts of the country where there are not necessarily, there's not a lot of manufacturing jobs, right? There's not a lot of agriculture jobs. You know, these are some places that are, you know, where it's not easy to necessarily get another job. That could potentially be really disastrous for the economy. At the same time, right, you start to see this big investment in VC funding for autonomous technology projects, including autonomous trucks. There's a lot of like big demonstration projects by Otto, which was Uber's self-driving truck technology at the time. They did this like big beer run where they delivered 25,000 cans of Budweiser across Colorado and like made a whole video about it and stuff. What they don't show you in the video is that the truck was accompanied by, let me see if I remember, it's like 2 tow trucks, 3 state troopers, and 4 company cars or something, plus a safety driver, right? Like there's no way, it was just like pure PR. This was not actually ready for prime time. But the point, right, was that they're drumming up all this excitement about the prospects of this technology. One thing I think is really interesting about kind of the narrative that was emerging at this point was this idea that truckers would be basically displaced from their labor. So this is an image from a Rolling Stone article that came out around this time. And I really like this image. I think it's really evocative because, you know, you see literally in this image that the trucker is like not in the cab anymore, right? Like he's sort of been rendered redundant by this idea that the truck can do the job better than he can. If you read some media reports or like funding statements by the startups that were kind of trying to push self-driving truck technology, a lot of them played on negative stereotypes about truckers. They would say things like, you know, this self-driving truck never gets drunk or wants to stop at a strip club, right? Like as ways to sort of suggest that human truckers were not to be trusted, and that the self-driving truck could replace them altogether. Oh, I should have put this earlier. I was wondering where this was. I must have mixed it up. This is 2014 data showing the most common job in every state. And you can see all these aqua states, right? 29 states. The most common job is truck driver. So this also just goes to underscore, right, like the potential, or what is viewed at that point as the potentially like catastrophic impacts of sort of like a phase shift where all these people lose their jobs in short order. Now, what I think, well, I mean, I feel like at this point for me to say what I think will happen is not this is like obvious because that didn't happen. But what I thought at the time would happen and what has since come to pass is that we don't see this sort of cliff of sudden unemployment. We almost never ever see that, right? In like any context where we're looking at technology driven or skill bias technical change, as it's sometimes called, where certain types of jobs are placed kind of at risk by new technologies. Very commonly what we see is not that people like all of a sudden lose their jobs in short order, but instead that you have this sort of cliff, right? Where humans and machines work together, like, or have to work together. Human labor and machine labor has to integrate. It may be that over time, right? If we're looking at like a 30 to 40 year time frame, it may be the case that in 40 years, we have a lot of autonomous trucks and we don't have human truckers as we think of them today. But over the short to medium term, which is what I'm concerned about, what we instead see is not that you don't have human truckers in the cab anymore. Instead, what you see is that humans are being forced to integrate their labor with machines in like very interesting and I think more pressing for our purposes as, you know, people who study the social world or care about policy in ways that I think are really impactful for how they experience work, for the safety of those jobs, et cetera. And so what I thought I would talk about just quickly is like what that slope looks like what does that integration process look like? I'll skip this for the sake of time, but like there's some good, like this is Michael Polanyi. He has this wonderful book called The Tacit Dimension that sort of talks about like why we would expect to see a slope instead of a cliff. Some of it is just based on this idea that like any job is more than just like a list of tasks that have to be executed, right? All jobs are more than the sum of their parts. There's also like some really important social reasons. We would expect self-driving trucks to not just take off all of a sudden. Even in the last week, right? Like Cruise self-driving cars, right? Those are passenger cars, got pulled off the road all over the country after like a really grisly and terrible accident. There's lots and lots of, we don't have time to go into it, but there's lots and lots of reasons why we will, I think, see change where we see autonomous vehicles being integrated into law and into social life. But that'll happen slowly, right? And some of that is because there's a lot of public fear. If you ask the public if they're interested in getting in a self-driving car, about 2/3 of people will say like, no chance in hell. That'll change, of course, but it'll change slowly. I put up, I don't know, has anyone seen this movie, Maximum Overdrive? Nobody. Sometimes there's like one guy. It's a great movie that you should see. I put it up only because it's like literally, it's an old Stephen King movie. It's like a literal horror movie about basically self-driving trucks. It's not shocking if people are afraid of self-driving cars or right have some trepidation about self-driving cars, an 80,000-pound vehicle just like, tunneling down the road next to your grandma is also very scary. Okay, so what does this integration look like? There are 3 potential models that I spell out in the book. I will go ahead and spoil it for you now and say it's the 3rd one. But I'll tell you about the first 2 real quick, just because maybe they're pertinent in other industries. I'll do it fairly quickly. The first is what we might call the handoff. So, oftentimes if you think about a work task and how a human and a machine might work together to accomplish it, the model that we sometimes use, or the metaphor we sometimes use, is this idea of like baton passing, right? Like I'll do some of it that's easy for me or to which I'm best suited, and then I'll pass the baton of the task to a machine, and the machine will do that part of the work task to which it's best suited. And everyone is really happy because we all kind of got to do the part that we're good at, and I got to keep my job. This model, sometimes I put up this picture. It doesn't look like this at all, but I Googled like human robot handoff, and this is what comes up. And I just thought it was funny, so I put it in the slide deck. But you can imagine there are some professions where a handoff model makes sense, right? So like robotic surgery is I have not studied robotic surgery in a lot of depth. So if you have, you can tell me that I'm actually wrong about this. But my hunch is that robotic surgery is kind of like this, right? Like you still have a human surgeon. The human surgeon is augmented by the robot who's helping to conduct the surgery. The robot is doing things the human would not be able to do. The human is doing things the robot would not be able to do. Everybody still has a job. Everybody's, I think, happy. Could say something similar probably in air piloting, right, where autopilot is used fairly routinely. Again, this is not an area I've studied, empirically, so maybe I'm wrong. But my understanding of the situation, just as a layperson, is that this is an area where this integration happens reasonably well, which of course is also a function of the type of industry it is, unionization, wages. Like it's not just that this like magically happens in some industries, but not others, but it's a model you could imagine in some context. This is a model that gets talked about a lot in trucking. The American Trucking Association is the largest trade group, represents a lot of the largest trucking companies. And they talked about kind of a model like this. They said at one point, if drivers are unshackled from the wheel, which I thought was like really interesting, evocative language by the trucking trade associations, use the language of shackling to talk about their workers. They could do these higher order tasks, right? Like inventory management or customer service or something. Similarly, Otto, which was Uber's self-driving truck division, talks about the idea that humans would just be able to like take a nap or learn a second trade or chat with their friends or whatever, right? Like have fun. The reality doesn't look like that at all. I will do like a really deep dive on this. Is anyone familiar with the Society of Automotive Engineers levels of autonomy? Okay, I will definitely spare you. Some people like really nerd out on this and some people just glaze over immediately. Let me just tell you this. This is a graphic depicting these levels of autonomy. So automotive engineers, when they're talking about autonomy, they want to know like, what do we mean by autonomy? There are different levels that correspond to a fully autonomous car that is just totally driving itself, and something that's kind of more like driver assist, like stuff you probably have in your car. Like the car kind of buzzes when you start to cross a lane, or it helps you parallel park or whatever. That stuff is like level 1. Level 5 is something that we just absolutely do not have. The current state of the art in autonomy is very firmly in the semi-autonomous region. It's probably about level 2, maybe level 3. I won't get into all the details, but basically what you need to know is that at the current state of the art, self-driving vehicles can do a lot, but they have to do it in a context where the human being is monitoring the driving environment at all times. They are not safe enough to operate in a context where a human being is taking a nap. You sometimes see that human beings do take a nap, right? And then oftentimes there is a major problem, right? Like there's a safety problem. In fact, like you may have seen, right? Or if you have, for example, like Tesla's autopilot is a level 2, right? You're supposed to keep your hands on the wheel at all times, right? It's supposed to buzz at you if your hands are not on the wheel or you're not paying attention. The reason for that is basically that you have to be prepared to grab the baton from the machine whenever the machine doesn't know what to do. And in a self-driving car, right? Like if the machine doesn't know what to do, it's probably because it's a safety critical situation. It's encountering something it's never seen before. And as you can imagine, right, like if you're in a vehicle and there's a problem, you have very, very little time to respond to it, which is why you can't be like just disengaged, daydreaming, watching Netflix, right? You have to be like ready to grab it. There's a lot, I'll skip some of this for the sake of time, but I go into it in a bunch of depth in the book. There's a bunch of really, really great like IO psychology and other information that we have, like theoretical information and empirical information about kind of how people handle being in a situation where they are like supposed to be waiting for an emergency. There's a really wonderful researcher, a human factors researcher named Peter Hancock, who calls this the hours of boredom and moments of terror problem. Basically the idea that you just like sit there until the car is like, oh my God, and then you're supposed to like stop things, right? NHTSA, which is the federal regulator that oversees things like autonomous vehicles, has done studies showing that it takes humans about 17 seconds to gain full control over a vehicle if they've like gone from nothing to paying attention. You know, right, like you guys have driven cars, you don't have 17 seconds to take over. There's a bunch of other issues too. There's something called vigilance decrement, which is that we are really, really good at paying attention to a situation where nothing is happening for just a few minutes, and then we start sucking at it really, really fast. There's really, really interesting studies conducted with radar operators during World War II that established this, and lots of other studies conducted in other contexts, right? Radar operators are doing something sort of similar. They're just like staring at a screen, waiting for something to happen. And then when something happens, they have to act really fast. And we just know empirically that they can't do that, right? They're really, really bad at doing that. So anyway, there's a lot of reasons why people think this might be an intractable problem in autonomous vehicles. There are a lot of autonomous vehicle startups that have just like actually completely shuttered or gone bankrupt, in large part because of the difficulty of overcoming this problem. So this is part of why I think this handoff model or the baton model is probably not what we should expect to take over in trucking. Okay, second thing, I'll go more quickly through this. So we might imagine that instead of, I'm gonna like throw this baton in your face to take over, maybe we have like a more controlled handoff, right? So like if Allison and I go on a road trip together, I might say, Allison, I will drive the car from like here to Ithaca, New York, and then you can take over and you will drive from Ithaca to wherever we're going, New York City. That would be a stupid way to go. But wherever we're gonna go from there, right? Like, I don't know my Northeast geography all that well. Right, but like that would be like how you would handle it, right? Like you would divide the trip into segments instead of dividing the task of driving into these kind of more granular subtasks. This was actually what Uber talked about doing. So a few years ago, Uber had like a big push into self-driving vehicles. And what they imagined doing was actually dividing up trucks' routes into basically long hauls and then kind of the last mile. So they had this vision where they would build these hubs all around the country. And what they would do is that the trucks would drive themselves over the highway between A and B. Driving over the highway in certain geographic environments is something that trucks are reasonably good at doing, especially in places like the Southwest, where the roads are relatively straight, the topography is relatively simple, you don't have a lot of weather problems. Like some parts of the country, this works reasonably well. Sometimes you even get like dedicated lanes that are set aside that are a little bit safer and more predictable. So you could imagine this could work in some places. And then what would happen is that human truckers would take over from these autonomous trucks at these kind of hubs and would finish the work, right? Would drive to the pickup point or would drive to the drop-off point or would drive through a city or places where it was more difficult for the trucks. The thing you can see, right, why Uber would have gravitated towards this model, because it's not super different from some of the logic that they've used in rideshare. I talked to Uber at this time when they were thinking about this model about like what this might mean for trucking labor. Now, remember I told you truckers are paid by the mile. And so what Uber basically had like proposed to do was automate away the lion's share of truckers' wages. Basically, they proposed to just like leave truckers with only the part of the job where they make no money. I actually thought, and it wasn't just me, like Steve Vaselli and other folks who study trucking were kind of like, okay, maybe there's opportunity here, right? A lot of truckers have for a very long time argued for a change in the wage structure of the industry. They would like to be paid for all the work they do, even when that doesn't involve moving fast, right? A lot of them would like to be able to get home at night. Like some of them would like to do local hauls, and those are just hard to come by sometimes. So maybe what Uber could do, which was, really powerful, could use a win, especially in the labor context, is like actually change this, right? Could actually go to the feds and say like, okay, it's kind of a strange bedfellows kind of thing, right? But maybe the way to make this model, like to realize this model, is that you would have to start paying truckers for all the work that they do. So I suggested to Uber, like, this would be a great idea for you guys, right? Like, wouldn't this be wonderful? I like to put up this quote just because I think I sound so stupid. But I was a writer for the Atlantic, Alexis Magical, wrote about this. And I said that I thought Uber was the worst. But then that this was potentially a way that they could redeem themselves a little bit by helping to kind of push truckers' wages in the right direction. Just a few months later, however, Uber shuttered its entire self-driving truck division. It was not related to this. It was related to IP problems that they had with Waymo, different issue. But the net result was basically that this model that they had proposed kind of evaporated. There's some other companies, like some startups, that have proposed sort of similar arrangements, but in fairly limited geographies. I think even for Uber, the infrastructural lift to build these hubs all over the country would have been like huge. So I don't really imagine that this is going to happen for a startup anytime soon. Okay, last thing, I promise I'm almost done. What is actually happening in trucking, right? I told you about two things that are not happening. What does the integration of trucking labor with AI and machine labor look like? This is what it looks like. This is a cartoon from a trucking magazine called Landline. Wonderful publication, I highly recommend it. I've been reading Landline for about a decade now. This is from a cartoonist named Mo Paul, wonderful guy from St. Louis. Yep. Really, really great guy. And he very kindly let me reproduce this image in my book and in talks. This is a cartoon that accompanies a column that was written in Landline about the robo-trucker, right? So that's where I got the title for this chapter of the book. And obviously, like, this is a cartoon, right? It's a caricature of technologies. Like, you don't literally see exactly these technologies in trucks, but actually, like, these are very, very barely exaggerated from technologies that do exist. So let me tell you just a little bit about kind of what the reference are that Mo is referring to here. One of them is camera systems. So lots and lots of trucks now have integrated into the ELDs. Remember, I told you ELDs have like all these auxiliary capabilities. More and more frequently, that also includes cameras. A lot of times those cameras are like outward facing dash cams, but increasingly they're also inward facing, trained on the driver's face. And also increasingly, those cameras trained on the driver's face are augmented by AI in order to detect signs of fatigue or inattention. So they might do that by, for example, looking at whether a driver's eyelids are beginning to flutter, right? Which is like something that happens when you get tired. Or looking at like whether the driver's head is starting to nod, right? Which also happens when you get tired. If it detects signs of inattention, the systems might do things like, well, first of all, they definitely tell your boss that happened, right? Like that gets logged. They might do things, some of them, they're all different ones. This is just one. Some of them will shine lights in the driver's eyes. Some of them will play loud alarms to wake the driver up. My very favorite one has like a seat cushion that vibrates and kind of like gooses the trucker back into alertness when he starts to get tired. So that's like one set, is kind of these camera systems augmented by AI. The other kind of big bucket of technologies are wearables. So these are things that the trucker wears on his body that detect things about things that are going on inside his body. This is advertised. This is no longer exists anymore. This was just a prototype. But Mercedes-Benz had a prototype vest that did constantly detected a trucker's heart rate, and it was connected to the vehicle. So the idea was that if the trucker starts having a heart attack, it pulls the car over, right, or takes over from the driver in one way or another. This is something called the Smart Cap. The Smart Cap does a constant EEG on the driver's brainwaves, looking for, again, signs of inattention or fatigue. Same kind of idea, right? Try and understand if the driver is fatigued, because of course he probably is. There's a lot of different technologies in this space. This is something called the Copilot, which is marketed by a company called Maven Machines. It's a headset that detects if the driver is checking his left and right mirrors frequently enough. There's just all kinds of stuff, right? It's like a fast growing segment. But the point here, right, is to like notice the distance between these two narratives, right? So the narrative on the left, the one I started telling you about, is this idea that drivers are displaced, right? That they don't have their jobs anymore, they're out of work, and that's what we should be concerned about, is job loss. The narrative on the right that we actually see unfolding in trucking is very, very different, right? By and large, truckers haven't lost their jobs. There's still just about as much demand for truckers now as there has always been. The difference is in like what that trucking labor looks like, right? And how AI is affecting it. And increasingly, the way AI is affecting trucking labor is not that it's kicking drivers out of the cab, it's that it's sort of invading the cab along with them, right? So it's in or on their bodies, it's flashing lights in their eyes. It's very much changing what it is to do the work of trucking, right? It's changing the dignity that's associated with that work. So what I argue we should do is when we think about the impacts of AI on labor, we need to be much more nuanced in our assessment of what matters, right? Like it does matter certainly to count jobs, right? And to say like, what kind of job loss should we expect? That's definitely where the policy focus has been. But it's also, I think, equally important to track these indicators that are much harder to count, right? Like what is it to do this work? How does it feel to do this work? You know, is it totally different, right? Do you feel completely disciplined? Are you wearing this stuff that's like tracking your brainwaves all the time? That stuff is harder, right? It's harder to track something like worker dignity. But I think it's just as important, right? And it's, I think, arguably affecting a lot more workers than the people who are displaced from their jobs. Very last thing I'm going to say about this is that even if you don't care about truckers at all, you should be concerned about this because in passenger cars as well, we're beginning to see the rollout of these types of technologies. So by 2026, all vehicles in the EU, and very, very likely all new vehicles in the US too, it hasn't happened yet, but it's very likely to happen. Anything that has driver assist, you know, or any kind of semi-autonomous capability, which almost all cars will have at that point, will be required to have some technology to monitor driver attention or impairment. It's still being discussed exactly what this will look like, but it's very likely that we'll see basically the same things that are going on in trucks going on in our own cars. So, and a really important part of that conversation, right, needs to be obviously about privacy, about the monetization of this data, right, all of these other issues. These images I know are a little bit hard to parse, but I'll just tell you very quickly what the one on the bottom is. Car and Driver, the magazine, did this like really, really wonderful review of like how people can thwart these driver monitoring systems. And they found that they could easily be thwarted with one of those pairs of glasses that you get like at like a gag shop that has like pictures of eyeballs. Basically, if it, not that I'm encouraging anyone to do this, you shouldn't do it. But I did think it was funny that they basically showed that if you had like the glasses with the picture of eyeballs, you could still take a nap and the car would move. You shouldn't do that, but I just thought it was a funny image. Anyway, that's where I wanted to end for today. Thank you very much for letting me talk about the work. And I'm excited to be in conversation with Allison. Yeah. Here, let me relax a bit. Let me go back to like a. Oops, what did I do here? Okay, I'll go that way. Oh, there's water.
Yeah. So this was fabulous. I am so excited about your work and I have a million questions. One of the things that I was especially interested in is how people resist surveillance and these sort of like subversion tactics. So I would love if you could tell us some of your favorites of those. And kind of related to that, I was wondering if there are patterns you noticed about like which drivers are more able to resist than others because of the sort of like differences in how much oversight they have, how big the firms are, and so on.
Yeah, those are great questions. So the chapter on resistance in the book, it was like by far my favorite to write. It was really, really, it was like the only part I felt good about in many days, right? The story's a little bit depressing. But seeing how people like still find space for exercising autonomy and reasserting their identity and all of that is like kind of more fun. So the chapter, like there are 12 strategies I talk about. I will not tell you about all 12, but I'll tell you like about 2 that are my favorite. One of them is that truckers are just like smash the thing with a hammer, like quite literally. There's like several truckers that were like, yeah, when they put that in my truck, I just like fucking smashed it with a hammer. Sorry. But that's what they said. And so I'm saying it too.
Direct quote.
Direct quote. Obviously, like that's not sustainable. Most of them got fired probably. Sometimes that was coordinated. So one trucker told me about a day that they all smashed it with a hammer, which, you know, they couldn't fire all the drivers. That was a driver that worked for like it was a furniture delivery firm. But, you know, like that's one thing and it's very direct, right? Like it's pretty unequivocal what you're trying to do when you do that. Another driver told me, or the driver didn't tell me this. This was a YouTube video that I watched where the driver, the subject line of the or the heading of the video is like how to hack your e-log, your electronic log. And what the driver does, it's this driver, his handle on YouTube is Scooby Tulsa. And he has this absolutely wonderful video. He shows how the electronic logging device is built on like a Windows backend. This is a few years ago, so I'm sure like this no longer works. But at the time, he shows how if you like have this certain sequence of keystrokes and you touch the left corner of the screen 4 times, and I can't remember what he does, but he has this like whole sequence, and he shows that you can like get to just the Windows screen. And then when he does that, the thing he does, he's not like hacking the data, he's not falsifying anything. He's going to the games menu to play solitaire. And I love it because I think like that to him is that's hacking, right? And he is so derisive in his tone of voice and in talking about like how the government put this thing in his truck, and he's going to show them, and the way he's going to show them is just by using it to play solitaire. And I think it, like, to me, says a lot about what resistance is, right? So like it shows, I think, that resistance isn't just about changing the material consequences of what you're doing, right? Like that driver is not getting any more money, right? Like he has not upended the system, but he has reasserted who he is and his autonomy to make decisions in a way that really, really matters to who he is. And I think that for me, like, was a good check. Like I had not thought about those as resistant activities at first, and like seeing how people did those things was helpful. The second part of your question, though, is really important, right? So you alluded to the fact that like not all truck drivers are similarly situated. It's a complicated industry, and I'll spare you like all of it. But like one of the big distinctions, right, is between owner-operator drivers and drivers who are employee drivers at big companies. That is more complicated than I'm making it sound. Roughly 10% of the drivers in the US are owner-operators, which means, right, that they own and operate their own trucks. That is really, really hard to do. You have a little more autonomy day-to-day. You have a lot more autonomy day-to-day about, you know, which hauls you're going to take, how you're going to control your time. But increasingly, those drivers are subject to predatory lease agreements or exclusive contracts where actually like they take on all the risk, but then they still don't get to make decisions about what they're going to take or where. So it's really, really hard for them. And then there's employee drivers, right, who tend to work for bigger companies, right? Some of them, of course, work for smaller companies like mom and pops, and some of them work for like really big conglomerates. So all of the drivers have to buy ELDs, right? Like that affects them all equally. But then, of course, the way that they are affected by that is different. So owner operators, for example, or if you like have a small company that's just like you and your brother or something, you have very, very little to gain by getting all of this analytic data that tells you like who's the best in the fleet or like what are the trends over time. Like that stuff is just not as useful to you if you're like, you know, a company of 1 or 2. The place where that value is really realized is, of course, at, you know, among the big companies who are using that for operations, right, or for incentivizing drivers in particular ways. So there's actually a really interesting kind of competitive aspect of this too, because what you see is that in the early years of the discussion around ELDs, at first all the companies were against it. They were like, don't mandate these things. And then over time, big companies actually were like, no, you should regulate. It's the same exact thing we see happening with like social media companies now, where they're like, oh, you should really regulate us. But like, I think the reason that those companies are saying that, and I think the reason big trucking companies also flipped on ELDs, is because they were like, we can stomach these costs, right, which small players can't, right? Like they had much more to gain from the mandate, right? Because like they could realize these efficiencies that other companies couldn't. So anyway, that's a long answer to your question, but there's a lot of interesting market dynamics there too.
Yeah. That's super interesting. You touched a little bit on another thing that I wanted to ask with this idea that like, if everybody smashes the thing with a hammer, then maybe they can get away with it. Do you see a lot of like successful collective action initiatives in the space, or is this difficult for like, the reasons that like there's so much around autonomy and people aren't working in like a physical space together? Or
yeah, it's a great question. I was just talking to Anne about this actually before we got here. So unionization, you know, trucking used to be one of or maybe even the most unionized industries, right? The Teamsters were truckers. I forget what the percentage of unionization was in trucking, but it was quite high in like the 70s. Now it's like low single digits, almost no truckers are unionized. And not only are they not unionized, but like for some of the reasons you noted, Allison, I think it would be very, very hard to use unions as a force for change in trucking. Literally, I think 0 truckers I talked to, when I would always ask them about unions, and they were like very, very anti-union, right? And I think a lot of it comes down to like, it's another bureaucratic structure. Unions have not always been great to truckers in the past, right? Like the Teamsters were run by Jimmy Hoffa from prison towards the end, right? Like that didn't always turn out great either. I think generally this kind of sense of autonomy and wanting to make your own decisions is seen as sort of cutting against unions, potentially against, of course, truckers' own interests. But I don't see that being kind of like the most likely route to change. There have been really interesting, I don't know whether to characterize this as collective action, but like trucking, I guess they are, like trucking protests recently, particularly in Canada, right? So like the Freedom Convoy happened a couple of years ago, was connected not to this technology, but to cross-border vaccine mandates. I have a lot to say about that. I can talk more about that later if people want. But that's like, I don't personally like agree with the politics of that collective action, but I can see why, for some people who participated in that, a lot of the people who participated in that were actually not truck drivers, but of the truckers who did, I can see why things like this feel connected conceptually to something like a vaccine mandate, right? Because they're subjected to these like invasive technologies. And for some truckers, that becomes like of a piece with the government saying you have to get a shot. So that's kind of, that's I think where most of the action is on that stuff.
And you think, like, you talked a lot about how essential truckers are, and like literally the entire like space that we're in is dependent on truckers working. You'd think that they'd have like a pretty good leverage to stop, but that's complicated for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, I mean, in the past, certainly, like there have been trucking strikes, mostly around oil prices, like in the 70s, that were very successful, right? And sometimes they got really violent, like they weren't unabashed successes on all counts, but like there have been forms of collective action that have been useful in the past, but that was under unionization, right? So like the context was different. And like as you said, right, truckers are atomized. It's very, very difficult to organize them because they're never in the same place and they work constantly, right? So like it's not obvious how you would, like I'm not a union organizer, but I don't even know how you would start. I don't know. Do you have a thought on this, Anne? I feel like you should answer this question. Yeah. Yeah. Right. They're just day to day. Yeah. I think that's a really good way of putting it. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Uber driving context. So the Uber driver, among the other things, and part of the group advocating heavily for the unionization rights for Uber drivers.
Oh yeah.
Fairly successfully, it would seem so far.
That's great.
And a lot of the things you're saying are very similar for full-time Uber drivers. And rideshare delivery drivers, et cetera, the gig economy. But one of the things that keeps popping up in terms of maybe a difference is like the competitiveness, where some people try to make it as if rideshare drivers are competitive, but it's very obvious that we're not.
You mean competitive between
against each other, like, oh, there's one customer there, like one of us is going to take them, but that's really not how the economics works. There's plenty of business for everybody. It's more of like the surge pricing with Uber and their own problems with how they manage that in terms of the competitive aspect. So it's very easy to, for example, go to the airport where lots of people are, go to the Cumberland Farms and add people to the WhatsApp group, and you can have a kind of collective action that's distributed, but there's a sense of unity, whereas it sounds like maybe the sort of like strong individualistic identity might be a struggle to that, and then maybe just the politics of unions and just the workforce being from different backgrounds. Like a lot of kind of a lot of immigrant labor that tends more towards one political area versus a lot more kind of heartland American sort of anti-union, just general based on propaganda from political parties. But I think maybe that competitiveness, and then the question that I'm getting to is, do you think the ELDs and the analytics have sort of been used to increase the competitiveness between drivers of like, let's say I'm a truck driver, because I have more data, it makes me more competitive and more cutthroat against other drivers instead of seeing them as, partners in a common cause.
100%. Yes, definitely. And there's a lot of really interesting ways that firms try to, this is like exactly what you would expect from like the anthropology of work, Harry Braverman and Michael Burway and, like all the theorists about like how like actually what happens is that management turns workers against each other. Like that's exactly what happens, right? So like, now you have this scorecard that says like you as the driver got a 7.6 this week, right? Which is like, what does that mean? Like that's not a metric that attaches to trucking labor, has historically attached to trucking labor. But now you get a score and it's about like how efficient were you and like how many violations did you get and like how on time were you, right? And like every company, not every company uses these, but a lot of them do, and they can all customize it. And then they do things to turn workers against each other, exactly like you said. So like the easiest thing to do is just to like hang a chart in the, to the extent that there's like a break room, right? Like to whatever the back office looks like, or to distribute it to drivers. That's like, guess what? You were driver number 60 out of 87 this week, which is something they do. Sometimes they like, this is like classic gamification stuff, right? They'll like toss, I talked to one company that they serviced like Red Lobster. I forget what the restaurant was, but like some mid-market chain restaurant. And they were like, yeah, when a driver drives really safely, we'll give them like a $25 gift card to the restaurant, which like was free to them, of course, because it was their restaurant. But whatever, they seem not bothered by that. My favorite one was a smaller company that wanted their drivers to be, I think it was fuel efficiency. That's like the big cost driver. So they all care a lot about that. And the driver who was most fuel efficient would get a bonus check sent in his wife's name to his wife, like for the month or whatever, right? So like what the company's theory was that if you like get the wives on board, the wives will like really pressure the husbands because they'll want to see those checks every month, right? So it was like I thought it was really like, it's very creative. It was really interesting to me because the narrative we tend to tell about the workplace and datafication is that it's all abstracted, right? Like it's just, numbers on a spreadsheet and there's no people there anymore. But actually, like some of the argument I make in the book is like, yes, that happens. But then these firms are very strategic in how they re-socialize that data, like bringing the wife in to like make sure that you're meeting your quarterly goals or whatever is like a fascinating dynamic sociologically, and does exactly what you're suggesting, right? Like makes it such that your competitor is the other driver, not management. Right. You can't do all the things at once. Yes, well, that's also a big part of it, right? The companies kind of want it both ways, right? The companies want the drivers to comply with the law, but mostly what they want is for customers to get, I don't know why I'm telling you this, you know that, right? They want the stuff delivered, and like they're pretty happy to look the other way if the drivers break the law. There's some really, I won't go into them now, but like there's a bunch of really interesting situations where I would like sit with a dispatcher and the dispatcher would be like, we run 100% legal and we never break the law at all. And then they would like tell the driver how to break the law. Like they would just be like, here's how you do it and don't get caught. Like if you drive less than 15 miles an hour along the like side of the road, for this company, the ELD like didn't register that it was driving, right? The threshold that detected driving was 15 miles an hour. So they were like, just finish the guy was like 4 miles from where he needed to be. They were like, just finish by like driving on the side of the road. That's illegal. Like you're telling the driver to break the law, but they like did not see it that way, right? Because it wasn't detected. So like for them, that was not discordant. I thought like I was like Woodward and Bernstein or something. I felt like I had like really caught up the smoking gun, and they like just didn't think about the rules as being like anything other than what am I going to get caught for doing? So anyway, a little bit of a tangent, but I'm glad you asked that question.
We can, if anyone in the audience has questions, we can also do that.
A separate, completely different question.
Yeah.
You were talking about, based on what you were just talking about, this came to mind because there's a massive Amazon warehouse that opened in Worcester, which is where I grew up.
Oh yeah.
And it is a ghost town. They finished building it and it's not being used at all. And you were talking about the need to, there's so much demand from people ordering online through Amazon and things like this. And then just one decision to change corporate strategy. And then you have this massive space that's supposed to produce jobs for truckers, for warehouse manufacturers, and there's nothing. And how much responsibility, if any, from a regulatory environment and just in general, is there on the companies like Amazon that are, overproducing the goods that are creating the problems in the trucking industry because of the pressure to deliver, the pressure for oversupply? Is there any kind of look upstream in terms of where the responsibility is for any of these problems?
No. I mean, that's a great question.
Right.
And it's great that you connected those dots. I have never seen anyone in Washington connect the dots in quite that way for a couple of reasons, right? Like I agree, obviously these are like not problems that are about truck drivers, right? These are much bigger problems with political economy and how we've organized labor in this country. And like the low man on the totem pole is truckers, right? So like the government ends up regulating truckers because they can, right? Like we have a regulator that does that. It's harder politically, right, for the government to be like, Amazon, if you should, right? Like they kind of like whisper, like, please don't do it. And it's not effective. This is not shocking, right? One of the arguments I make in the conclusion of the book is that like, the ELD is in many ways, I think, a red herring. Like the problem in the industry is that people just aren't paid for the work that they do, right? That's like not unique to trucking, but it's like really acute in the trucking context. There are lots of ways you could imagine addressing a problem with safety, but remind me to come back to the safety question, with safety and economics that involve like reorganizing an industry or removing somebody's exemption from fair labor law, right? Like there's lots of different ways to address it. The way that we have addressed it in the United States is by saying like, let's just police them harder with a digital Band-Aid. And that is like not shocking because we do that all the time in healthcare and education and criminal justice and like pretty much every high stakes environment. And Gozzi's work, I think, makes this abundantly clear, right? Like we take a context where we have decided to allocate limited resources, right? Or have decided to like basically make people fight it out for public goods. And then like, we're like, oh, you know what? Like, let's use software or algorithms to apportion housing or something that like people should be entitled to. And then we'll be like, that's a tech problem. But of course, it's not a tech problem. It's like an econ problem or like a social problem or a cultural problem. And that's what's going on here too, right? It's just that like, we're kind of like moving the deck chairs around instead of doing what we actually need to do, which is remove people's incentives to drive themselves literally to death, right? And like that we're unwilling to do. So we turn to technology. Sorry, I feel like I just soapboxed right at you. But anyway.
So I feel like I have maybe like a pair of like generation one algorithmic accountability questions.
Okay, well, good, let's do it.
I'm curious to know about, first of all, capital P policing of this data. Is there any history of law enforcement trying to get these electronic logbook data
Yeah,
for
good
what
question.
purposes?
Yeah.
And then also maybe like a due processy sort of question, like I think I know the answer to this, but just to hear it. I imagine these logbooks make errors and mistakes and the software has issues.
Mm-hmm.
How do drivers contest, not resist, but actually contest the results of the algorithms, and in what fora does that come up?
That's such a good question. Okay, so the first one, I do not know of contexts. It's not to say they don't exist, but I don't know of contexts in which police have subpoenaed this data or requested it from the ELD. I mean, you could imagine that this, if it hasn't happened, like it will definitely happen, but I don't know of context yet in which that's happened. But I'm sure it's coming. The people that was not your question, the people that we do see being like very, very interested in this data are third-party commercial interests, as you would also expect, right? Because this is what happens in every context. So like companies that want to market goods and services to truckers, or like parking is a good example, right? There isn't enough truck parking, so now you have to reserve your truck parking. And how do they know when there's going to be truck parking available that they can sell? Well, they have all this ELD data that they can use to generate predictions, right? So like that's the kind of gold rush that like we see everywhere. But I haven't seen the state get into it in that way yet. The second question about like how do truckers contest? That's also a really good question. There's a recent, I think it's ongoing lawsuit under the Illinois BIPA, the Biometric Privacy Act, involving truckers. And it has to do with ELDs, but it's actually more about like it's the authentication mechanism for ELDs. Maybe you know this. Do you know this case?
I don't know the case, but I know about like employee.
Yeah. So that, and I think that's currently pending, but I'm pretty sure they've passed some initial, I haven't been following it that closely. They like maybe pass summary judgment. It's a little bit orthogonal because I think basically they just didn't get consent. And if they like just got the truckers to all sign something, it would have been fine. In terms of inaccuracy, I have not seen contexts in which truckers really say like the algorithm got it wrong or the data collection was inaccurate. And here's how it has, the place where you see that actually, there's been at least some good press and anecdotal reporting about Amazon delivery drivers, especially the folks who work for, I can't think of what it's called. It's an acronym. But like Amazon, like maybe you know this, like Amazon like has a subcontractor that does a lot of, they're called like transportation something companies, TPAs or something like that. TNCs, that's what it is, TNCs. And there's a lot of suggestion that they use really similar kinds of technologies in delivery vehicles that track things like whether the driver is paying attention to the road, and then maybe the driver like goes to get a drink of, you know, their coffee or their water or something, and it says like, oh, you took your eyes off the road, and then they have to do like a whole unpaid like tutorial or coaching or something. And I have seen discussion about potentially pushing back on that. I have not, but I have not seen it in this context. I will keep an eye out though, because it's an interesting question.
Okay. I think if anyone has any last quick questions, we can take one more, but we're about at time. So I guess I didn't actually give you a chance to raise your hand for a question. So we can think, oh, actually, yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
If that's okay.
Yeah.
Quick question, I guess. So sort of last thing that you had shown with the encroaching into the more public space of the technology to say monitor your awareness on the road and the like. Would you say that's being pushed mostly by government or by insurance or by maybe data companies?
You mean sorry, say again, in the context of
just monitoring in your own vehicle, say how
for
awake,
passenger vehicles.
yes, yeah, how awake you are.
I
Who's-
see,
who's
that's
the
a really
major
good
pusher
question.
of that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think most of that is currently coming from government. So I mentioned the EU has kind of led it. Some of it has been a response to kind of iffy corporate practices by like Tesla, right? Which, you know, has really pushed back actually against the idea that you have to monitor driver attention. Like they just like refused to do it for a long time. Then they said they were doing it, but they weren't really doing it. Right. And so now the feds are regulating it, which maybe, to be clear, like I don't necessarily think that's the wrong outcome, right? Like I do think people should be probably paying attention in their vehicles. We also shouldn't be selling something called autopilot that like can't actually pilot the truck. Like that feels like a really important misnomer to me. Like it's not shocking that people are like, yeah, I don't have to pay attention to this. So yeah, I think a lot of that is coming from the government. You mentioned insurance. Like I haven't talked about insurance at all in this talk, but insurance obviously is very, very interested in all the data. There's lots of cases, you know, like to Andy's point, the cops haven't necessarily been as interested in this data, but insurance companies are very, very interested in it, both for good and bad reasons, right? Sometimes it can be useful for a trucker, for example, to be able to show like that they weren't at fault. And the camera systems can sometimes help to establish that they weren't at fault. But establishing, you know, behavioral patterns and generating predictions from this data is definitely like obviously a big value source too.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, let's give Karen one more round of applause. Thank you so much for joining. And just as a quick note, we'll have our final speaker on December 4th in Barrister, so next door at the law school. I hope to see you there. It'll be Vina Duval, who will also be talking a little bit about Uber and wages. So please come. Thanks for coming today.